Welcome to the Content Strategy Interviews podcast. Each week, we talk with accomplished content strategy experts to share their wisdom with our friends in the content community. And now here's your host, Larry Swanson.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to episode number 15 of the Content Strategy Interviews podcast. I'm really happy today to have with us Morten Rand-Hendriksen. Morten is a really well-known figure in the WordPress world and in the design worlds. Actually, let me have Morten tell you a little bit about his background and how he got to be a content strategy guru and WordPress expert.
Hello. My name is Morten. I am currently a senior staff instructor at LinkedIn Learning and lynda.com. And I've been involved in web development and web design and content strategy in some fashion since probably the late 90s, early 2000s. I built my first website in 1998. Yeah, that sounds about right. And took on.
I don't want to alarm you, but that's 20 years ago.
I know. It's. I was doing the math in my head, going, "Oh, it's a long time ago." And I think I took on my first client that wasn't me in 2003 to build something. And yeah, I've just, I came into the web when it was something new and weird. And you had to know a lot about server architecture and how to just get things to work at all to get anything out to people. And I've watched the web evolve from this really, just duct taping server code together until something comes out the other end that is not just garbled nonsense, all the way to where we are today, where we're starting to talk about migrating content off screens and onto other interfaces. So I have a lot of history in the community, and I've seen an evolution. And through all of this, I've been very interested in looking at how we use the internet to communicate and how these technologies change how we communicate. Because it's one of those things where it's like the large hard-on collider. You can't know both where an object is and where what speed it has. If you interfere with it, you stop one of those. It's the same, I think, with how the internet and the web works, that when we started publishing content on the web, just the fact that we could do hyperlinking inside content immediately changed how we thought about accessing content. And then that in turn changed how we published content. And when we changed how we publish content, we changed how we access content again. And there's been this very dramatic change in how people perceive content, understand content, and share content that is driven by the technologies we build. Mm-hmm. So as we're building new technologies and new interfaces and new devices to access that content, we'll see another dramatic shift in how people perceive content, create content, share content, and understand content.
Well, I think you exemplify the best of content strategy, and that ability to grok and use and manipulate all the technical stuff to do what you want to do. But it sounds like you're always focused on communication. In fact, that's one of the things I finally did a day or two ago. I finally took your lynda.com Fundamentals of Content Strategy course, and I thought that was one of the most succinct articulations of the field that I've seen. But it kind of had that foundation of it's ultimately all about communication and getting that right message to the right person at the right time. Mm-hmm. Can you tell me how did that course come about? Did you propose that, or did they come to you? How did that course come together?
The way we produce courses at LinkedIn Learning and lynda.com, which is the same thing. Just so if you're listening and you go, why is he saying these two things? lynda.com and LinkedIn Learning is exactly the same thing. They're just two different brands for the same thing. The way we produce courses is, there's a couple of ways. Either an instructor says, hey, I want to make a course on X, and then the content manager says, that's a terrible idea. Let's do something else. Or that's great. We need this right now. Or the content manager comes and says, hey, we need content on this, either because we don't have anything or because we have an old course that needs to be updated. And we'll approach one of the instructors and say, do you want to do this? if I remember correctly, I think that the content strategy course came to me from the content manager, though I'd have to go back in my notes to find out.
Got it, yeah. But it was, like I said, I thought it was one of the most brilliant, succinct things. Did you develop the curriculum yourself once you got the assignment, or?
Yeah, so the conversation just started with how do we communicate content strategy in a new and modern way to people, because the way that we often think about content strategy is anchored in old ways of thinking around just content in general. And what we were looking for was a way of getting people who normally don't think about content strategy to not just think about it, but actually understand why it matters to them. That means everyone from a server architecture specialist all the way to the front-end developer and the content strategist and the designer and the person who actually writes the content. So my task was to create a course that showed the wider scope of content strategy, like why it touches on every piece and how to run through a process so that everyone can lend to the content strategy and everyone understands where content strategy comes into play. That because it appears in all aspects of web development. If people often ask me, why would backend server engineer care about content strategy, for instance? And the complicated answer is every single decision that's made about how content is handled, even if it's at a database level, is content strategy in some fashion. The most practical example I can think of is if you're making an e-commerce site and you have a ton of products that you want to share, you can make data blobs that contain all the information about that content if you want to. So you have one database entry per item of that you're selling, and then that database entry will have a bunch of pieces of data. So you'll have the title of the item, you'll have the price of the item, and the sale price of the item, the description and the images and all that stuff. And it all sits inside one little bucket. So anytime you want to get information about the product, you go and say, give me the item that has ID 542, and then you get all that information. And then you can write a script that sits on top of that and says, actually, I only want the title and the price and one image. And then all the other data just gets thrown away, and then you just display that one piece of data. That works, but it's exceptionally inefficient. And it also doesn't address the need of the end user. So if you thought about it from the end user's perspective instead, you would say, what are the different ways an end user might want to access this content? And under what circumstances do they want to see what information? And what you'll quickly find is the end user will likely, depending on where they are in their purchasing process, either just want to see an image and a title and a price, or they might want to see just an image, a title, and four images and the title and the price and the sale price and a short description. And then if they're very interested, they'll go in and want to see the long description and the specs and everything. And if you consider that, you'll see that instead of putting all the data in one big blob, you'll break all those data pieces out. So you can say, give me only the title and the third picture and just the sale price and nothing else. That then makes the process for the server much easier. It means that when the data comes to the client, so the browser or whatever tool they're using, the client doesn't have to parse through the data and figure out which parts matter and which parts don't. It can just display whatever it gets, and it makes the entire process much more efficient. More importantly, it allows other services to go in and understand the data that's being served up. So you can see this if you go to Google right now. It's kind of neat. If you go to Google and you just search for a product, so you say, I'm interested in the Fitbit Ionic, or something like that. Then Google not only will give you the search results for who sells this in the product itself, but it'll also give you shopping options, where to buy it. And what's happening is the sites that are listed under Google that actually show up like this are sites that have marked up their content in such a way that Google goes in and says, hey, you look like a site that sells stuff. Can you tell me what you sell? And then the site will say, here's this Fitbit device, and this is the price, and this is everything. And it's marked up so that the Google understands it and can index it properly. That is where things are headed next, is we as humans are going to start behaving more, or start expecting our tools to behave more like what Google is doing right now. So, for instance, we will want to have our home assistant device, whether that be Alexa or Cortana or Google Now or whatever, the thermos with the speaker on it that you put in your house and you talk to the CIA wiretap. We will want that thing to be able to give us this kind of contextual information. And for that to happen, the front end of the website needs to be marked up so that the device and the AI that runs behind it understands the content. That means it needs to be contextualized, it needs to be marked up correctly. In turn requires the output from the database to clearly only output what is necessary in individual pieces of data, which in turn means the database needs to shard up this data and store it properly. The end result of that is the future technologies we have, so not the home assistants, but whatever glasses or contact lenses or implants we're going to have that give us this artificial reality experience where we just think of something and it pops up immediately. All those things require that same way of thinking, that the data needs to be split up and connected together. And that is content strategy. Like this idea of truly contextualizing your data and just explaining what it is, and then figuring out which parts of the data matter to what users, and giving them only what matters when they need it in a format they can use.
Right, and in a format, in the context of what gadget or setting they're in that's going to display that. Yeah, and you're right. You're almost scaring me with all the possibilities. But I think you're right that there will be some art. Will be these cybernetic AR people just thinking about man, I wish I had a cup of coffee, and boom, there you go.
That was the impetus of the course, really. That I had that conversation with one of the content managers. He's like, "Yeah, we should probably make that course because." That is a way of thinking about this that connects all the pieces of the chain.
Right, and the way you just described that, I can totally picture going to like you said, anybody up and down that chain, the back-end database guy, oh yeah, I get it, we got to do it that way so I can structure the data in this way, all the way up to the front-end content creator and going why do I got to do this meta stuff and all this extra information about it and fill in these extra fields, and it's well, no, it's always about the end user needs and what you need to give them at the time. Hey, one thing that's a kind of an interesting segue into something else I wanted to talk with you about, which is the Gutenberg project over at WordPress. And WordPress, I think, I always have to contextualize this. As a content strategist, I have to stay CMS agnostic. But I'm sort of also, everybody knows me as an unabashed WordPress fanboy, and I just love that community, and I like what's going on there. And it's also a big, important, regardless of that, it powers 29% of the world's websites. So something like 29% of content strategists are probably working with WordPress at any one point. But anyhow, so you've talked a lot about Gutenberg, and just for people who don't know, it was first articulated as a new editing experience, a new kind of WYSIWYG editor for WordPress, but it turns out to be much more than that. Well, actually, you speak much more eloquently to that. Let me have you describe where Gutenberg came from, kind of where it's at now, and its implications for content strategists.
Gutenberg, or as it should be named now, the WordPress block editor, is a rethinking of how the user interface for content editing presents data. It is also rethinking of how WordPress handles that data on the back end. So whereas before, if you just set up a fresh WordPress site, you would have effectively two types of content that you could work with. It would be posts or pages. And a post or page would comprise a title and a content blob. So that's a big editable WYSIWYG area, and then some categories and other meta content. What Gutenberg does is say all the stuff that happens in the current version of the block editor says all the stuff that happens inside the content area. Each individual piece of that content may be something that requires further context. For example, if you write a post and you have some paragraphs, and then you have an image, and then you have some more paragraphs, that image is a different type of content from the paragraphs. And that different type of content may require some sort of property that is unusual. So Gutenberg then says, each of these things that you add, so each paragraph, each image, each list, each block quote, each whatever it is you're adding needs to have its own context so that you can go in and edit that context. So in an image, it would be aligning it left or right, or making it full bleed, or doing something else like that, or adding or subtracting a caption. For a list, it might be indenting or not indenting the list, or changing the type of list display. For a block quote, it might be changing it from a block quote to a pull quote. But that's just the tip of the iceberg, because once you have this contextual editing of individual blocks, you can do things like go in and say, this paragraph needs to have a colored background, or needs to have a drop cap on it, or needs to have larger fonts. And this title here needs to be aligned differently from the other titles. So you're basically doing what you would normally do in a content, what do you call it? A content modeling exercise. So you look at each piece of content within a larger view, and you say, what is this piece and what is its function? And how can I edit the function to make it serve its purpose the best way possible? And then you skip to the next piece and you say, what is this piece and what is its function? And how can I make this function work best for its purpose? And you can do that inside the WordPress editor. So that's step one of this project. Step two is to extend this block way of thinking outside of the editor. So right now it's only exists inside the content. The next step is to move it outside the content so that you can take, for instance, you can write some part of a post and then define that as a shareable block. And then you can reuse that block elsewhere, and you can then place that block somewhere which is not inside a post. So you can imagine if you were writing book reviews. That's a very practical example. If you write book reviews, you may make a block on the bottom of your book review that says about the author, right? That has a picture of the author or a picture of the book, and then some blah, 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 and some affiliate link or whatever. And you know that you want to reuse this box somewhere else at some point, and you don't want to have to go and edit every single instance of it once you've reused it in multiple different places. So within this new block editor experience, you can go in and say, this piece of content here is a reusable block. It then gets saved outside of the post itself as a separate individual unit that is then editable and reusable. And you can place it in another post, or you can place it somewhere else on the site, and it'll appear the same way. And then if you want to, you can go in and say, I need to update my link, or new information has come about, or a new image, and you can go in and change it inside the reusable block, and then it'll change everywhere else as well. Which is why it relates to content strategy and what you were talking about. Right. So basically, what the Gutenberg team is trying to do is introduce the main feature that has been missing in WordPress, which is the ability to treat content in WordPress database not as large tomes of data, blobs, but as more contextualized pieces of data that are combined into posts or pages or other types of views. Mm-hmm. Now, the way it's done on the back end of WordPress is not great, because the way it's handled is it's still a blob. All that block data still ends up in just one database table. And then there's a bunch of tags that go into the data that you can then query, which is not, it's problematic because it doesn't give you the performance benefits of splitting the data up. It also isn't scalable in a way that splitting the data up properly is. And I think part of that, there are many reasons why it happened like that. Part of it was just the fact that the perspective that the people who were working on the project came from was, we are changing the editor.
Right.
So you work inside the editor.
I want to back up just a little bit from that, just to talk about it. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the current implementation of Gutenberg is still that, like you said, it's like HTML comment tags within that content field. But one of the things, I had a really super quick chat with Matt Mullenweg at WordCamp US about, okay, but what about the repeatable blocks? Where do they go? And I think I can't remember what he said exactly, but I think it's basically it's like post meta. That's every developer's solution for like where you put the other thing. Is the post meta table. Is that, and that to me seemed like the beginning of like maybe a place to put this stuff, a part, that would give us genuine chunks, not blobs, to work with.
Let me rewind a little further so you can see how all this works. So if we take a deep dive into how WordPress handles data. So the way that people have gotten around the problem of the WordPress content blob in the past has been to say, in addition to the content area, so the regular WYSIWYG editor, I will use custom fields to add more data. And then you can use either just the custom fields in WordPress, or you can use some sort of plugin like advanced custom fields or custom meta boxes or something else. All of these tools, what they do is they say there are two types of content on the site. There is the content area, and then there's the meta content area. And then they do this thing where they, in the meta content area, add a huge string of content with basically a massive array. And then within that array, you then have a ton of other content pieces. So if you go to a site that has multiple different content boxes inside the editor, the main content area goes into the content table. All the other stuff goes into the meta table. And that means you have two blobs instead of one. But it's still just two blobs. So the meta content is actually extremely poor, has poor performance. So the problem was never solved by using content meta. What the repeatable blocks specifically do in the block editor is there's a new custom post type inside WordPress that is just the repeatable blocks post type. So when you make a repeatable block, you're actually making a new post, and then it gets related to the wherever you place it. And that is, from my perspective, where everything needs to go. So instead of thinking only repeatable blocks should exist in this repeatable blocks post type, my thinking is every view, so what we now call pages or posts, which won't be pages or posts because we'll just make piles of blocks. So every view will be a meta index of blocks, and then the blocks live separately somewhere else. So each block is an individual unit. Now that, of course, brings up questions around what should be a separate block, what shouldn't be a separate block, under what circumstances do you split them out? Does it make sense for every paragraph and tag and list and everything to be an individual block? It doesn't. But this requires basically a content strategist perspective, which is what I was saying, that I think the reason why things are the way they are now is because the Gutenberg project started with a design and then went in and said, we're changing the editor. And then they worked within the editor context, and the editor context implies the content table. If we went back and started over from scratch, I would have been much more loud about starting with content modeling and said, look, what are the pieces of content that may go into a post? What do they look like? What are their properties? And how do we split them out so that they are handled separately in the database? And then how do we collate them in a way that produces what looks like a post on the front end, but is in fact just a bunch of different blocks? And I think the repeatable blocks idea is the very, very small fallback for that, or the very small start of that. So my hope is, as we move forward and the block editor comes into core and people get familiar with it, that as new extensions to it come online, and as we start thinking more about how this works outside the content editor, the data will get split up more, and we'll be able to have better control over which pieces of data are stored where and how to access them. Because, like I said, in the future, people won't likely go to a post or a page. They'll ask for pieces of information from multiple posts or pages and want to tie them together. And currently, even after this block editor, that still requires querying enormous tables and then parsing out information from those tables and putting them together, rather than actually just saying, I want this piece over here and then put it where I want it.
Do you know, has there been much performance testing with the current setup with that new place for repeatable content, and how quickly? Because I know that was another thing at WordCamp US that was a big, well, I mean, Google was there pitching their site improvement stuff. And I know that's always been a big thing in the SEO world. And that Google's activities there, and just now starting to show up like at Search Engine Land and those kind of publications. They're talking about the need for performance improvement in the WordPress world.
Yep.
Do you see hope for that, or a handle for that somewhere in this sort of expansion beyond posts and pages into this new? There's, like you said, at least conceptually, there's one new place to put these new blogs. Do you see building on that to get something that maybe is performance optimizable?
I see potential. I think I'm the guy who comes in and says crazy things, and the people go, "What? No, we can't do things." So my approach to this whole thing is Gutenberg, or the block editor, is our opportunity to really jump WordPress forward. WordPress is lagging behind in many respects because WordPress is based on very, very old thinking about databases, about what people want, about how people access content, about everything, basically. And WordPress is built around this idea of backwards compatibility. Nothing should ever break if you revert back to an earlier version. I believe that this block editor is such a fundamental shift in how WordPress handles data that we should be saying, look, this is the breakpoint where WordPress no longer is backwards compatible, because the backwards compatibility is becoming a huge drain on resources and a huge problem for future development. So I've been pushing very aggressively for a new thinking around the idea of backwards compatibility and ways of basically offloading ourselves off that giant grand piano that we're towing behind the car right now. Whether that's going to happen or not is unclear. I doubt it, because it's too entrenched in the community. But what I think will happen, what I know will happen, because I'm involved in it, is people from the outside of the WordPress community will start coming in and saying, I don't care if you don't think we should do this. We're still going to do it. And we're going to introduce new ways of thinking about every aspect of this. So if you take WordPress and you say, WordPress is just an interface that lets you talk to a database in a human way. And then we say, okay, so once the database has the data, we're going to use the new parts of WordPress, like the REST API and new technologies that exist on the web, and pull the data out of the database and then display it in new ways on the front end to prove the idea that the way that we can dramatically improve the performance of WordPress, we can improve or extend what is possible with WordPress within the confines of how it currently works by throwing out the old and true and tested ways of thinking about this, which I follow all the time, and really think about what would WordPress sites look like if we started from modern technologies and modern design practices and modern modern approaches, and then used WordPress just as a data source.
Mm-hmm. That's like, you mean like a headless CMS essentially, where or like conceptually like that, where you're handling all the back end stuff and then people stitch it together via APIs or other calls to that system?
Sort of. So one of the things that I'm working on right now is this concept of views rather than pages and posts, right? So instead of thinking of, here is a post, you see the title and the content and the blah, blah, blah for the post. And then you go to post number 2 and number 3. It's to say what you're looking at is a view. And the view has maybe a header and maybe a menu and maybe a sidebar or 2 or 5 and maybe a post and maybe ads and maybe a footer, but it doesn't have to. And it should be decided based on whatever you're currently looking at. So some views should have all these things and some should only have one of those things, and they should be related in some way. And when you start thinking about it as views, and then you bring in this block editor concept where you say that each thing that you're seeing in the view is just a block. You can say, I should be able to control not only what blocks I see, but how those blocks are related, and whether I want to see all these blocks. And if you take that into the design language, and you can say, look, we should be building themes, essentially, that allow you to just drag and drop blocks in where you want them to appear. And then the blocks should be dynamically updated on the front end based on the user's behavior. So that means if you're on a site and you say, I'm reading a post, and then there's a link to a related post. There should be a way for the user to click on something or do some interaction that results in just the post component in the view to reload without touching any of the other stuff. And then if this post component reloads and there is some related content in the post component that's relevant, then that content should also reload if necessary. So for instance, if you have a view where you see both the posts and the comments, then then reloading the posts should somehow dynamically say, I also need the comments here. And then the comments should just come in on their own.
Right.
And all that should happen in a logical way. So you can basically go in and swap pieces as you're looking at them. And this should all be done in a way, like this should be enabled in such a way that it makes sense to the end user. The person sitting there visiting the site shouldn't have to think about, how do I go about getting this new? It should just naturally appear, right? You make a logical interaction, the next thing appears. You've seen this on some sites, like Quartz does this in a way where if you go to the Quartz website and you select a post and you just scroll, then the next related item just appears. And then it'll just keep scrolling and it'll just reappear. So this is our way of doing it, but you're basically just backloading a ton of content into the browser. So I'm thinking there are other ways of doing that same thing.
Right. Hey, I want to back up and just clarify a couple things real quick there. One thing you just said makes me think. So first of all, the way these views are evolving, it's like you said, that's like the logical center point linchpin where all the like logic about what gets displayed, and that's based on like either both user behavior and other contextual clues that just decides what that view is going to display. But one of the things you just said, that part of that view could be the post information. Are you, because it sounds like you're almost, and something you said earlier about the, do you really need to have separate blocks for each bulleted list and each picture and all that? Are you thinking that there could still be room for like the old fashioned, or, you know, the conventional, what we have now, post content to still be part of this whole scheme? And
absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
And that's maybe the hardest part of this is we have to start thinking about what is the function of a post or a page or some other piece of content, rather than thinking about. So right now the frame of mind is this is a post, and a post has certain properties. What we should be thinking about is what is a post, and which of these properties are relevant to the post in what circumstances, right? So for instance, if you go to a standard WordPress site, like you go to my site right now, you click on any one of the posts on the front page, you go to a post, and it has a bunch of information. So it'll have its title and the featured image and the actual post itself, and then it has meta information about when it was posted and the categories and tags and everything. Most of that information, like if you ignore the title, featured image, and content, the rest of the information is more or less irrelevant to the user unless they are actually looking for something else, right? So the post date only becomes a question if they want to make sure the content is still relevant. The categories and tags are there to are intended to be there to communicate how the content is organized or give you some meta information about what type of content you're looking at. But the way people are using categories is more to just apply taxonomies to their content, so that, you know, you go look at things under the WordPress category, then you'll find only WordPress type content. If you look under the cats category, you only find cats, right? But it does, when you look at how people actually use WordPress sites, they rarely ever look at the category display because it's too random. There's no structure system to how they are applied. I've been to WordPress sites where thousands of posts are filed under uncategorized, or a WordPress site where every single post has a separate category. So there's no, we're not diligent about using the taxonomies. Therefore, the taxonomies are relatively irrelevant. So one of the things I'm toying with is this idea of, rather than explicitly showing people the relevance connection between two things, to say we're going to connect things in other ways. That would either be by saying you are reading this post, you should get other things that are relevant to this post within whatever relevancy the user or the authors think is, but we're not necessarily going to tell you how they're related. Or it could be we're we're going to explicitly tell you how they're related, but when you go into a specific post, you're actually going into a category. And you're just getting the latest content from that category, and you're kind of thrown into a stream of content. And then think about how do we then enable the end user to make choices about how they see content,
Right.
which relates to all these other more systemic issues with how the internet works. One of the things that has become a huge issue that we're talking about a lot, like you've seen Facebook and Twitter and all these people be called in on to various governments to explain themselves. That's mainly because they are using AIs to do exactly what I said, but they are using it with the sole purpose of getting people exposed to more advertising. So their purpose and their driving force behind filtering content on the internet is not to show people the relevant information, is to get people to stick to the site for longer and click on more reloads to get more ads. Right? And that's how you get these echo chambers where if you have a specific political affiliation, then all the content you see on the internet will just support your views, or specifically give you the absolute most extreme other version of it to anger you into clicking on more things. So you don't get the full picture anymore. You only get this very biased display of what's going on. And we as content creators need to figure out a way of combating that. Mm-hmm. So I am working on a site for someone. I can't say anything more than that. I'm working on a site for some entity where we're trying to figure out how to say, if you read an article about a topic, you should be presented with 2 other articles afterwards that show 2 other views, specifically. So, if you keep going for, let's say, you lean heavily liberal or heavily conservative, and you keep going for the liberal one, then more and more conservative content will pop up to force you into seeing the other view of it. Now, when I'm saying more and more conservative, I'm not saying more and more extreme conservative. I'm saying you are exposed to more content from a conservative viewpoint. So the increase in frequency of conservative content goes up if you only look at liberal content, and vice versa. So that you just get exposed to the other side of a coin. And that could go for anything. Like if you're only reading Marvel content, whatever other DC comic universe shows up a lot, like just to provide people with the necessary pushback to their own ideas so that they can be better informed about what's going on.
Right.
And
well, that kind of gets it.
All of these things stick together because a lot of the decisions that have been made, or a lot of the things we're seeing on the internet now, are caused by people not thinking carefully about what the content they publish does to the people who read the content, and then what the decisions they make about how content is interacted with changes their behavior when they go onto the internet, right? So when they consume content in a certain way because they've been trained to do so by the things that we've designed. And those things have been designed around driving people to click on ads rather than other things. So if we throw that out and say, how do we give people access to the content they need and enable them to find the necessary perspective to understand their viewpoint in the context of the larger world, and use our data structures to support that, then we can not only move the platforms forward and just build better websites, but we can actually move society forward as well.
Yeah. Well, one quick thing about that, there's a lot in there, what you were just talking about, but one little quick thing about that is sort of the responsibility of any content creator or publisher to give more thought to the taxonomy, because that is such a driving thing in a lot of what you were just talking about. I think a lot of it's other contextual things that, like you said, AI and stuff like that. But what you said earlier about how some sites, they're all categorized as uncategorized or the same category throughout. But to have people be more, I think if content strategists or webmasters or publishers or whoever, we're all more diligent to categorizing things, that's at least the top layer of providing, kind of doing our job, but also providing more more avenues for that. Hey, one thing I want to point out, we're way past the half hour. I can't believe that happened. If you're good on time, I did want to ask, well, actually, we should probably, I want to honor your time, and I've got to run pretty quick too. But let me ask you one thing. Like while you have the ear of my audience, is there anything else that's like about Gutenberg or content strategy or just the state of the interwebs in general that you'd like to share with my folks while we're here?
You kind of touched on it. Hold on. I'm going to bring something up because I need to get this right. I've been working on my actual background in outside of the web is philosophy. I'm a philosopher by trade. I just don't actually do it because I couldn't find a job or someone would pay me to be philosophizing all the time. So one of the things that I've always tried to bring into my conversations and my craft on the web has been thinking deeply about what we're doing and why we're doing it and how it impacts the world and all that stuff. And I've come to the conclusion that what the internet world needs now is ethics. Not just do the right thing, don't harm people, that kind of airy-fairy, empty promises kind of ethics, but actual deep thinking around ethics. To that end, I've spent the last 2 years writing an article because that's how long it takes to write an article. And it's currently in editing, so hopefully will be published at some point. They asked for around 5,000 words. I think the current version is 9,000 words, so it's a little long. But with some good editing, it'll probably come out sometime this spring, hopefully. And the core part of that entire conversation is a framework that I've created that I want people to apply to anytime they think about pretty much doing anything, but specifically around designing content, presenting content, just handling content in general on the web. So there's a 4-point question series that you can use whenever you make a decision. So let's say you want to create a podcast about content strategy. Then you can ask questions to yourself to test whether or not you are comfortable with the ethical implications of doing this. So the questions are, number 1, what world are you building for your visitors in doing this? And by that I mean, what capabilities are you granting or enabling in your visitors by creating this podcast or designing this ad or whatever it is? So first think about when you build something, you have a direct impact on the person using it. And that impact drives them towards a future. So what is the impact on that person? And what capabilities are you giving them by doing this? What can they do with the information you're giving them? Then the second question is, what kind of person do you become by doing this? And is that the kind of person you aspire to be? So are you, because you're building yourself, and are you turning yourself into the type of person who just blasts people with ads all the time? What does that do to you as a person? The number 3 is, what duties of care do you have to your visitors? And would you want every other person in your position to do the same thing you're doing? So essentially, are you establishing, by doing an act, you're establishing a best practice and a trend and a expected behavior. So is that something you want everyone else to do in that same situation? And do you have a duty to the end user to protect them from something or to grant them something or something else? And what are those duties and are you upholding them? And then finally, does what you have done improve the lives of the people affected by your decision? And who does it impact? And who, most importantly, does it, I don't know what the word is, negatively impact?
Right.
Because with every decision, you are excluding someone from something, or you're preventing something from happening, or you're making a choice on behalf of someone. So consider carefully what impact your decision has on other people. And if you run through that list every time, I'll share it with you so you can post it up.
Thanks.
Yeah. If you run through that list every time you make a decision, you'll see that a lot of the decisions we make are not necessarily well thought out in terms of anything other than the goal we're trying to achieve. So it might be, get more followers or earn more money. But then you're like, earning more money results in people basically hacking elections. Maybe that wasn't the best idea, right? Or if I someone was showing me this app yesterday that used, what was it? Oh, right. So someone was talking about how they wanted to improve one of those apps. You can, in big cities now, you can go to the internet and find companies that basically do food delivery for you. Mm-hmm. So you say, I want food from this restaurant, and then they'll like bike to that restaurant and pick up the food and bike it to your house, right?
Yeah.
And then this person was saying it's very annoying because I don't know where this person is, right? So I don't know when they picked it up. I don't know how long it'll take before they get here. And if they say 20 minutes, but if it takes more than 20 minutes, I have no way of contacting them. So their solution was, we're going to put GPS trackers on them so I can see where they are on my phone. And I want to be able to text them to like message, right? And then I immediately go through the list and I'm like, okay, so what world are you building for your visitors? What kind of person do you become doing this? What duties do you have to the visitor? And the end result is tracking bicycle messengers on GPS is a terrible idea, because if someone wants to target them for something, they know exactly where they are, which is just horrible outright. And if it's on this like thing, it would be very easy to say like, I want McDonald's. Actually, no, I want to harm you in some way. I just need to know where you are, right? And texting people on bikes is just an absolute no. That also goes for cars. But I mean, anyone in transit who is not able to just immediately stop and not continue moving, it should not receive any text messages of any kind, or even be able to see or respond to them until they physically stop, right? So that's the kind of ethics we need to have in our community, is not just saying, this doesn't harm anyone, but actively think through the process. Not just, is this going to be good or bad, but think the whole chain through. What does it do to the people? What world am I building? What does it do to me? What is the end result? What kind of best practices am I setting up? And that way we'll make better decisions. It's
I'm
not
just wondering if you
specifically content strategy, but it's holistic thinking about what we're doing. We have a lot of power by building the internet, and we need to use that power wisely.
Yeah, well, I think there's a huge amount of, like you were alluding to, the political stuff and the communication. And I was just kind of snarkily wondering if you had a persona in mind as you wrote that, like Mark Zuckerberg, or I recently saw Jaron Lanier spoke here in Seattle and talked about how we're basically doomed until Facebook abandons the advertising model.
Yep.
And which is kind of like, when you run through those 4 points, it's like, well, yeah, well, Zuck, you need to get on top of this. So
that's my end goal. To get
Mark
Zuckerberg, if I can get one of those big wigs to actually think carefully about the consequences of their actions. The big challenge, I think, for us is the people listening to this podcast. If I say blanket statement, ads are evil, then they'll be like, okay, unsubscribe, right? Yeah. And the reality is, ads are not evil. What's evil about the current advertising model on the internet is the pervasive tracking that is attached to the ads, right? That they use as to figure out our behavior and then model content around a specific type of person and then turn us into that kind of person solely for the purpose of exposing us to ads, right? That's not something a magazine can do. You don't pick up a magazine and then you go like, what is it, like Vogue or whatever, which is like 98% ads and then occasional articles in the middle. You don't pick up that and you go, oh, I now feel compelled to only read fashion magazines forever. And then the advertisers get benefit from you. Like, that's not how the real world works, but it is how the internet works in a very real way, right? You pick up a magazine, a Vogue magazine on the internet, every other magazine in the store will now be fashion. That's the difference.
Yep.
And that's where ads become problematic. So it's in how it's in the lack of thinking about the consequences of the future built for the end user that everything falls apart.
Well, it's interesting that there's not, I mean, I'm glad that you're doing that. And I'm glad that the conversation, that hopefully that'll kick off a conversation about ethics in this medium, because that's something that, this is my 15th episode of this, and I've been, talking to a lot of people and kind of going to school on the discipline of content strategy for a couple of years now. And I don't think ethics has come up that much. That's super interesting. I'm glad to have that in the mix. Well, we should probably wrap it up here.
Yep.
It's like, yeah, coming up. But thanks so much, Morten. It's been great having you, and look forward to seeing you at a WordCamp or some other event soon.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening. Tune in next week for another content strategy interview.